Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. It's time once again for another one of our ism segments, and today we're going to cover an ism that probably I'm more excited about, not because I'm in favor of it, I'm actually quite opposed, but I find it more interesting than probably many of you would or may if I fail. It's an ism probably most of you have never heard of. It is called Socinianism. Socinianism. It's spelled S-O-C-I-A-N-I-S-M. And Socinianism comes from the teaching of a couple of Polish teachers, an uncle and a nephew who shared the same name, Sozzini, S-O-Z-Z-I-N-I. And they were a part of, in Poland, the Anabaptist movement, the Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation, you will recall, were those that rejected any number of either very important or essential doctrines of the faith. Not all of them denied essentials, but many of them did. And this particular group certainly takes the cake. They, as a group, denied the pre-existence of Jesus. They were non-Trinitarian and were in many ways the forefathers of the Polish Unitarian Church. But they also denied that God knew the future. And this is where the idea sort of hits the rubber of this idea hits the road of our days. There are a fairly large swath of folks who embrace this idea that God does not know the future. They may be Trinitarian. They may believe in the preexistence and the deity of Christ. They may believe in the virgin birth, but they don't believe that God knows the future. And so while their roots maybe don't necessarily go back to the Socinian movement, and while they don't embrace all of the Socinian errors, there is, among those who claim to be evangelical, these folks that embrace open theism, which, again, is one of the key defining things of Socinianism. So, what is open theism? What do we mean when we say God doesn't know the future? Exactly what we're saying. In this view, God does not know the future. And this is claimed to not be a denial of God's omniscience, because when we say that God knows all things, we mean that God knows all things knowable. For instance, God does not know, I would agree that God does not know what a square circle looks like, because that's nonsense. There's no such thing as a square circle, never can be. It's a contradiction. Not even God in his omniscience can understand and embrace and grasp a contradiction. So I don't have a quarrel with saying there are things that are sayable that God doesn't know. God also doesn't know what it's like to sin. So there's any number of those things. However, the issue is whether or not God can know the future. Can God know the future? And what they would say is no, he can't, because the future is contingent upon the free choices of humans. I once described open theists as those who were faced with the choice between the two doors. One has a beautiful woman on the other side, the other has a tiger. They have to either choose that God doesn't know the future, or they have to choose that God knows all things because all things have been predetermined. And they chose the tiger. These are folks who, not wanting to disparage my Arminian brothers who don't fall off this horse, but who nevertheless, these are the folks whose Arminianism is, I would argue, more consistent, more coherent, still horrible, more horrible than Arminianism because of its consistency. God doesn't know the future. One of the chief proponents of this ideology is a pastor by the name of Greg Boyd, one of the sort of modern or contemporary fathers of the resurgence of this idea was a gentleman by the name of Clark Pinnock. Clark Pinnock was actually at one time a rising star among the Reformed, but he apparently took a radical turn and went the other direction. And he died about, 5 or 10 years ago, and I posited this idea that when Clark Pinnock appeared before the throne of God, God said to him, "If I'd have known you were coming, I'd have baked a cake." Well, be on your guard. You don't probably have to worry about Polish Socinianism in its fullness, but you do need to be on your guard against open theism, which partakes of that Socinian error. And rest assured, your Father in heaven most assuredly knows what's coming. And he knows it not because he can see into the future, but he knows it because he wrote the story. You know, this propensity that I have in this segment, Heroes You Never Heard Of, to sort of push against the idea of fame as a measuring stick for our heroes. I do this because I've been guilty of this for so much of my life. When I went to seminary, I enrolled at Reformed Theological Seminary in 1989. This was the first year that the Orlando campus of RTS opened, and among the faculty there were R.C. Sproul, Dr. Richard Pratt, Dr. Roger Nicole. Not long afterwards came in Dr. Ron Nash. I felt like this was an all-star team. These were all men whose work I was familiar with and respected before I went to seminary. In fact, when I was a kid, my father had been invited to speak at one of the conferences put on by 10th Pres in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Conference on Reformed Theology. And also speaking at that event was the pastor of 10th Pres, Dr. James Montgomery Boyce, and professor from Gordon Conwell Seminary, Dr. Roger Nicole. Well, when they printed up the brochure for this event, someone made a mistake along the way, and the names all got jumbled. So that there was a picture of my dad with Roger Nicole's name under it, and Dr. Boyce had my dad's name under it, and Dr. Nicole had Boyce's name under him, and it was so deemed to be amusing that someone from the staff sent a picture to my family, and they were amused enough by it that they put it on the refrigerator door. Well, as a kid, I saw the humor. It wasn't that funny, but I saw the humor. But what it meant to me was these were the absolute rock stars of the Reformed world. Jim Boyce, R.C. Sproul, and Roger Nicole. And lo and behold, two of those three were professors at my seminary. And there was the church history guy. He also taught a kind of spiritual formation class, not very theological, kind of squishy. This guy didn't have, I don't think he had a PhD. He was older, he was more gentle, more soft-spoken. And so I didn't appreciate him like I should have. I thought he was JV. But he was a great man of God. His name is Frank Farrell. And Frank Farrell was the right guy to choose to teach a class on spiritual formation because he was such a godly and gentle man. It took a required class that I had to have with him to introduce me to him and the character that God had cultivated in him. What's interesting, and this is again one of the great qualities that I love about the heroes that you've never heard of, is their great propensity for humility. Even though I had never heard of Frank Farrell, and probably you never have either, Frank Farrell worked very closely with two very influential men, one of whom was Carl Henry, who, by the way, also was an adjunct professor at Reformed Seminary. I got to take a class with him my first January term. And Carl Henry was instrumental in the starting of Christianity Today, influential in the starting of Fuller Seminary, and he had as his sidekick, as his right-hand man, Frank Farrell. Also actively involved in the founding of Christianity Today, which, once upon a time was a good thing. Instrumental in that was a gentleman by the name of Billy Graham. Perhaps you've heard of him. And Frank Farrell worked with him as well. But I never heard that from him. I heard it from other students who knew about it. I assume, because he was an older gentleman back in 1989, that Frank has gone on to his reward. But I still remember him. I still look up to him. I still admire him. I still feel shame that it took the blessing of hearing him speak day after day in class, the blessing of watching him simply walk across the campus with a gentleness and a humility. It took far too long for me to learn what should have been obvious to me, that he was the kind of man I wanted to be when I grew up. Why do we find hardship so hard? Well, the soft answer is because it is hard. The hard answer is because we are soft. When I feel overwhelmed, and I do, when I feel like there's just too much tension in my life, I often go back to D-Day. However difficult a situation might be, I've never been in that kind of situation. I do not struggle to understand why so many soldiers suffer from PTSD. I do struggle to understand why they all don't. Many hardships may seem more difficult than some other people's, but surely there are others whose hardship is more difficult than mine. Perhaps, however, what makes it so difficult is the devil's incessant attacks in the midst of the hardship. He does not flee during our hard times, but attacks, pressing his advantage. He adds insult to injury by insisting that not only are we going through hardship, but that we are going through hardship proves that God is against us. It is one thing to have a health scare, one thing to have month left over after the money is gone, but it is a whole other thing to have the maker of heaven and earth see you as his enemy. Which is why the solution to hardship is rarely to alleviate it. Instead, the solution is always to repent and believe the gospel. We repent for, among other things, our ingratitude. So much of our hardship is grounded in a stubborn refusal to be grateful for the overwhelming blessings we already have. We look at the glass as half empty, forgetting not only that it's half full, but that we are due no glass, no water, and we are in no danger of literally dying of thirst. He leads us beside still waters, and we complain that we're not on a tropical beach watching waves roll in. He brings us to green pastures, and we grumble that it's been a while since he gave us a sugar cube. Repenting and believing the gospel go hand in hand. As we repent for our ingratitude, we enter into gratitude, remembering that even if we are literally dying of thirst, when we're good and dead, we'll be warmly welcomed into paradise. We answer the devil's accusations with God's assurances. Not only does God not see me as his enemy, but he tells me I am his son. Not only is God not pouring out his wrath on me, but he's already poured out his wrath on his son. Which means that every hardship is a gift. The work of God in reshaping us into the glorious image of Jesus. Of course, it hurts to have our rough edges sanded off. Hardships don't come wrapped up as blessings. Often, in fact, they come from others who are intent on hurting you. None of which changes the truth that they are blessings and that they actually help us. Jesus, friends, not only changes everything, but Jesus always wins. And he is the one orchestrating all things. We do not simply grin and bear it. We do not either deny the pain of the pain. Instead, we cry out to the one who loves us, trusting him and giving thanks. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.